Hello and welcome to Books Up Close, the podcast. I'm Chris Lloyd. This is the close reading show for writers, readers, and anyone who wants to know how texts get made. In today's episode, I talked to Elaine Castillo about the opening of her novel Moderation. Elaine was named one of 30 of the planet's most exciting young people by the Financial Times. She's the author of the debut novel America's Not the Heart, the book of literary criticism How to Read Now, and her most recent novel Moderation, recently named a New Yorker Best Book of 2025, a Time Must Read Book of 2025, and a Best Book of 2025 by Kirkus Reviews. She works so her rescue German Shepherd Vincent can live a better life. Well, Elaine, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
This is really exciting. Everybody, Moderation is just the book. You should have gotten the book by now. But if you haven't, go buy it. Maybe pause this episode and then just read it first and then come join us. However, we are going to be talking about the very opening page of the book. So there's no kind of spoilers. There's nothing you need to know. And we're going to be doing a close reading as you will as readers. So I think that's quite exciting. But before we get to the passage, Elaine, how do you feel about close reading? I mean, you've written a book called How to Read Now. So I do feel like you will have thoughts about what close reading means, or as an activity or a practice.
Wouldn't it be funny if I was like, I don't really care about it, having written an entire book that's literally about the politics of reading and about close reading and the value of close reading? I think, in a lot of ways, I think maybe the only reading I've known has been close reading. And I think, in How to Read Now, I talked about reading not just books, but films and reading as also just a practice of being in the world, that an active practice of being in the world and experiencing and engaging with the world as it is, as opposed to how we would like it to be or to uphold some agendas that we might otherwise prefer, like with Austin or some of the things that I talked about in How to Read Now, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But yeah, so I think close reading has been a partner in my life and a way of navigating the world, I think, since I was a kid. And maybe that's because of being a kid of immigrants and because you have people in your home who speak so many languages, so you're so familiar already with the illegibility of what the world can be like, that close reading ends up being almost a survival mechanism.
I think it's in the very beginning of How to Read Now. You say books aren't the destination, they're a waypoint. Reading doesn't bring us to books, books bring us to reading. And that's such a great formulation, right? Of, in that book, you're not just telling us this is how you pick up a book. It's how do you read the world around you? And I kind of started this podcast because I was like, have we just lost a handle on words? The words just not mean anything anymore, right? The world has become so saturated with all kinds of myths and disinformation and Gen AI and all these things, right? Whereby words are just evacuated of meaning. And I'm like, can we go back to knowing that words do have stuff in them?
Yeah. It's funny, I haven't thought about that. Well, I haven't read How to Read Now, I think probably since it came out. And yeah, I do still think that. I do think books were, even though I love books and consider I have been called a literal bookworm from, maybe from birth. I think people thought that I basically ate books. I went through them so quickly since I was a kid. That what they really did was sort of build me up as a person in the world, not even just talking about building empathy, which is a kind of idea that I sort of skewer in the book, but just the idea of being someone in the world who is active and trying to be commensurate to the world as it is, trying to not just read the world around us, but to read the history of things, the context of things, that to be a critical reader is also to be. And I think sometimes this idea of being a critical reader has this kind of dryness to it, where it's like, oh gosh, it's this sort of academic way of thinking. But to me, critical reading is such a sensual, joyful, emotional practice. I mean, a lot of times, when you're doing critical reading, you're getting angry a lot of the times, so the visceral experience of being someone who is deeply engaged in the world is what being a reader is, a close reader and a critical reader. Someone who is not
metaphor,
just,
just scroll to the bottom,
the terms
click,
and
yeah,
conditions of your own life, but actually just clicking, okay, I accept, but actually reading.
So this passage we can look at today is a really interesting
Well,
way
that's
to begin.
I think we are asked to do that,
which does
in almost every aspect of our lives.
Every time I'm like, I don't want to talk about the whole book. I want to do proper close reading where we just pay attention. But at the same time, you telegraph quite a few things in this opening that I think are really exciting. But why don't we hear it first, if you wouldn't mind reading it for us?
So this is from chapter 1 of Moderation. I always say it's a very difficult book to give a content warning about because it's about the very people who don't get the benefit of content warnings, who are, content moderators who have to filter through the morass and the muck and the harrowing violence of the internet in order so that we can all sort of experience Facebook, Instagram, as pleasantly as possible. Whether or not that's pleasant as it is debatable, but it would be less pleasant without this labor. So I do give a content warning for it. Also, because despite everything I've just said, this does become a love story. So, chapter 1, Little Brown Fucking Machine. Girly was, by every conceivable metric, one of the very best. All the chaff long ago burned up by unquenchable fire. The ones who had hourly panic attacks, the ones who took up drinking, the ones who fucked in the stairwells during break time, the ones who started bringing handguns to the office, the ones who started believing the Holocaust had never happened, or that 9/11 was an inside job, or that no one had ever been to the moon at all, or that every presidential candidate was picked by a cosmic society of devils who communicated across interplanetary channels. The ones who took the work home, the ones who never came back the same, or never came back at all. The floor was now averaging only 3 or 4 suicide attempts a year, down from 1 or 2 a month. The ones who remained, like her, were the wheat. The exemplars, tested paladins, the ones who didn't throw up in the hallway and leave the vomit there. They'd been, to continue speaking of it biblically, separated. None of the white people survived. Not that there were many of them to begin with. Young middle-class hopefuls bulging with student debt, they'd shown up around the time the position was still being called process executive, back when the site was still in the Bay Area, back when she still lived in the Bay Area, back when any of them still could. Most of the white candidates didn't make it past the initial 3-week training course. The ones who did left within a year. The majority of the workers had been Filipinas, with a smaller minority of Cambodian, Indonesian, Laotian, Vietnamese workers, people who knew about the job through that reliable network still unmatched by LinkedIn, otherwise known as family. People who'd grown up knowing their mothers and aunts had been moderators, and so too would they follow.
Amazing. Thank you. Loved hearing you read that. I could have let you read on and on, but then I was like, we need to focus on a particular passage. But it does hint towards stuff, right? And I think that's what's quite striking about it as an opening passage, right? Like my main takeaway, I guess that my first point is that like we don't really know where we're grounded for quite a while through those opening paragraphs, right? You're really delaying some kind of key information for the reader. The title of the chapter is hilarious, and you're like, wait, where are we going with this, right? Like, where are we going? And then Gurley was, comma, by every conceivable metric, comma, one of the very best. And so automatically you're kind of like, what is our frame of reference, right? The name Gurley is like the first word of the book, and it's so different in kind of language from like every conceivable metric, right? They're very different kind of semantic worlds. And I really think when I first read it, I remember reading it in a cafe outside, and I was like, wait, what? And I had to reread the sentence because I was like, what are we talking about? Where are we? And I wonder how interested you are in that, like not letting readers have like an easy way in straight away.
It's funny. I think I've had this conversation a few times on or and I think because people, who have read my first book and then obviously who have read the second book. So I think a couple people at different events, so this is definitely a thing. Like, so you like to start your books with a punch in the face. And I thought, wow, okay, I've been read. I was like, yeah, I think that is true, and I'm sure for the next book I have to figure out a really gentle, slow kind of setting the tone way of beginning the book just to challenge myself. But yes, I do think there's an element of I think discombobulating or starting with a certain kind of energy that I think is a through line. With all of my books, but in particular, America's Not my first novel and this novel, the way those books sort of open is with a thing that is quite, I think, destabilizing for a reader, especially a reader of like a 19th century novel that sort of begins with sort of setting the tone. But I think it's also with the I love that you're pointing out the kind of differences, the kind of different registers that are already in the first sentence, because obviously people don't know that girly is a name, that it's a quite sort of common, I mean, I would say sort of corny auntie's name in the sort of in the Filipino community, but that there's that kind of friction between that word and then the kind of more sort of mannered way of saying by every conceivable metric. So I think you're already sort of getting a sense of someone whose way of thinking about the world and way of being in the world is something that is moving between registers. That is someone who has to, I mean, I think the sort of common way of thinking about it would be to code switch, but who comes by that naturally. But I think I also knew that I wanted to begin the novel with a kind of a sense of, I always say that this novel is about people who are very sure of themselves and who they are and the genre they think the story of their life is being told in, and are 100% wrong. So to begin, and I think I was thinking about this because I'm about to have a conversation about Pride and Prejudice and sort of this novel, and we can talk about that later. But novels that begin with a sort of a sense of a truth that then is broken down or complicated. She is someone who is the best, and that's the point at which the novel begins, and then the rest of the novel is sort of unfurling and complicating what that actually means, and is that actually true, and if it is true, what are the costs of that and the stakes of that.
Yeah, one of the very best.
Very good. Yeah, she's not even just one of the best.
And we're like the very best of what, right? But also girly, which you say like might be heard differently depending on who the reader is, right? Like maybe a Filipino audience might hear that name and hear something, but like I hear that name and it, it conjures up femininity, right? In like its most kind of like stereotypical format, but girly, like then you also think about like young, not like you think about age, right? And also, I mean, this is probably part of close reading, but on this copy, like the chapter title is in this very like swirly font too.
Yes, that was very, very, that was done also in a kind of nod to the sort of modern Regency aspect of it. I knew that I wanted this, you know, quite bombastic title, which is a reference, by essentially passport bros to, Southeast Asian women, with the kind of very sort of Regency Jane Austen kind of romantic font, because there is, I think the novel is playing with that in sort of thinking about what a modern Regency novel or what a modern Austen novel looks like in this particular setting. But yeah, and then there's also that thing of like colloquially you'll be like, sort of, if you're talking about one of your friend, you're like, oh, girly made a bad choice. Just talking about a friend of any gender. I mean, girly is a non-gender sort of term of affection, I think, for me and my friends. So I think there's also that you have that kind of friction with is it a kind of name? Is it a sense of intimacy, but at the same time a real sense of removal and shock?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. Like, oh, like she's such a musicals girly, right?
Yeah, exactly. I just said to someone recently, "Oh, I'm a Persuasion girly, not a Pride and Prejudice girly."
I mean, that is the best Austen novel, but we don't have the time to get into that today.
Absolutely. Yeah, okay, thank you,
We don't
thank
have
you.
time for that today, but it just is. People go, you can comment. I don't care. And so we've got one of the very best, but then the second sentence, which turns into like a 9-line sentence. So you've really gone from this like condensed opening, like punch to all the chaff long ago burned up by unquenchable fire. Again, like a very different kind of language again. The ones who had hourly panic attacks, the ones who took up drinking, the ones, the what, like, so we get this the ones repetition, and then and then that turns into or. There's so many things there that I'm thinking about, right? One is like the ones, like the sense of like there's so many people who are just like the same, right? Like the ones, like that kind of person that does this thing. And very quickly it's like the ones who had hourly panic attacks, you're like, okay. The ones who took up drinking, then the ones that fucked in the stairwells, then the ones that started bringing handguns. We're in such a different territory. Then the ones who started believing the Holocaust never happened. You're like, okay, I'm now getting a sense of like this tapestry of people. But again, we still don't know where we are, right? We still don't know what a Hugeli is, but we've got this like now this wide kind of global context of people in very different situations and like world beliefs. And I'm interested in like who is speaking right at this point of the book, right? Like who the narrator is. That's my always first question to myself and my students. And sometimes it kind of we are in just like Gurley's brain, right? Free and direct discourse style. But sometimes like we're not. And I'm wondering all those times, like those slippery places where because all the chaff long ago burned up by unquenchable fire, that doesn't sound like her. But then like or that no one had ever been to the moon at all, that every presidential candidate was picked by a cosmic society of devils. That then sounds like the language of the people that think that ridiculous thing, right? It's almost like we drift into their Lexis, kind of. And I'm really interested in how that sentence just unfurls in this really kind of chaotic way, which is so different from that first sentence.
I think sometimes I don't necessarily. I mean, I definitely when I'm writing, I don't always think of who is speaking, but sometimes I think of what is speaking. in terms of the kind of thematics of what I'm trying to convey, especially in that opening. And for this passage, there's really a sense of, I kind of, thinking about it as a kind of zooming lens that kind of zooms in and zooms out. So you have this kind of macro vision where it's starting to unfold, that you're looking at a kind of a mass of people, a particular group of people who have subgroups within them, but are sort of different subgroups of a particular, what you discover is a particular force of workers, a particular sort of mass of workers. So you have this kind of zoomed out lens, not quite omniscience, because I actually really tried to avoid omniscience in this novel in a way that I think I made use of omniscience and more in my first novel, because the omniscience is it's a device of knowledge. It's a device of, well, this is, I'm telling you this because I know it. The characters don't know it, but I know it, which is a useful device, especially in a first novel where I'm talking about intergenerational kind of communities in which people have known each other for a really long time. But ultimately, moderation is a workplace romance about people who don't know each other that well, and also fundamentally about people who think they know things and are wrong. So omniscience is not really helpful to that project, because what you want to do is stay with your character. I mean, at least for me, what I wanted to do is stay with my characters in their certainties, because that's when you stay with your character in their certainty, even in their blind spots, that only deepens the shock when they experience the moments when the world actually surprises them. So, like, especially the beginning chapter and the opening chapter is really one of all of the things that this world is certain about, that Gurley is certain about, that here are all the truths and the kind of the foundational truths of this world, political, economic, sort of in terms of the kind of labor relations ultimately, that are going to be the foundation of this book. I mean, I think was thinking of this subconsciously, but I think because in How to Read Now I'd written about Austin, and I'd written about this kind of like political fervor that had come about because this Austin Museum in Chawton, I think, had sort of dared to contextualize Austin in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, and talked about her ties and her family's ties to the slave trade, and her father being a trustee of a sugar plantation in Antigua. And obviously, this attracts the same kind of cries of woke revisionism or whatever. I think that probably planted a seed of thinking, well, if I were going to write an Austen novel or a Regency novel, how would I do that in a way that makes visible the labor relations that are invisible? I mean, in an Austen novel, or the foundational kind of labor and resource extraction that makes these sort of grand manor houses possible. If those sort of relations were visible, what would that look like? And the opening chapter of Moderation is very harrowing for something that ultimately becomes a romance, but I think that is so fundamental to the project of the love story that I end up sort of trying to explore, by a love story that doesn't require us to make these kind of labor relations invisible, but brings them to the forefront, and they are at the core of what the stakes are for this main character, why falling in love would matter to her.
Yeah, and it's like it's a total inverse of the Austen, where you're saying like the Austen kind of opening statement of like, this is the condition of people, right? This is the human condition. This opening, it's almost like that unfurling sentence is like throwing everything at the reader, being like, these are all the kinds of people that you might meet in this workplace. This is what Gurley is put in relation to, right? Like this is who she's bettering, right? These people who are like slightly deranged, slightly panicked, or or are totally in their own.
And also they're weak, right? They're these rest of these workers who are, and content moderation is a deeply harrowing, punitive job. So, the fact that her fellow coworkers would be crumbling under the job is absolutely normal.
Yeah, exactly.
And that would be self-medicating through these various sort of venues is absolutely normal. So you also have a sense that she's like, well, all of these people are ultimately just weak, and I'm strong. I'm that's why I'm better than that's why I'm good at this. And then you sort of then have to think about, well, who is a person, what does it take to become a person who is good at this job?
Yes, who can withstand so much,
Who
right?
can withstand,
Resilience,
exactly.
my most hated word of the moment, right? Like
Yeah, God.
that I'm like, why would you want me to be resilient? Like, this is the conditions. But at the same time, we still don't yet know that this is about content moderation, right? These could be any kinds of workers, really, that we don't know. The ones who never came back the same or never came back at all. I really love that repetition, but with like the much darker twist, right? Like some that might be changed, or some that might just like we never see from again. And there's something quite again, like maybe not foreboding about what's to come in the novel, but you're right, you're like hinting at something like what's to come, what is the scope of this book. We definitely don't know this is a romance at this point. Like, there's no way. The ones who remained. Oh, the line before that, the floor was now averaging only 3 or 4 suicide attempts a year. That only, averaging only. And I'm like, whose only is that? Right? Is that Gurley like telling us that, like in her mind, right? That she's speaking kind of institution speak? Or is it like the institution kind of speaking? Is sometimes what I think, right, in this book. Well, not the institution, but like the idea of like the workplace itself, if that had a voice, that like this is the language that you would see in a report, or like in a kind of, oh, but they've gone down, right, in like a, you can imagine a big boardroom, right? Oh no, but we're way down, and it's like, what? Wait, what? Like, you have to. I think if you read quickly, you kind of miss that, like that only kind of suggesting that things are good now.
Yeah. The only is very important for the kind of sardonic sort of dark humor of the only is, and I think you're getting at it, that the kind of question of, what is this girly speaking, or is this the institution speaking, or the workplace speaking? I think the truth of the matter is that, especially for someone like Gurley, that those borders would be very fluid, that you, in order to survive, you would have taken on the kind of capitalist logic of the institution in a way that you yourself have a kind of sardonic sort of distance from, like, oh, we're only averaging 3 or 4 suicide attempts a year. So, is a kind of, there's a sarcasm to thinking about the sort of human lives in that way, and the kind of and the kind of worker welfare in that way. But there's that kind of blurriness between what makes the institution or what makes the workplace happy, and how an employee or a laborer will begin to parrot that same logic. And I think that starts to show up later in the book as well, with people who are very happy to just to speak all of the kind of toxic positivity of the corporate sort of logic jargon.
Yeah. And but even just like corporate language per se, right? Like, I work in a university, so I'm very used to people talking university speak, to the point that now it's all I can hear in meetings. I'm like, I keep threatening to make like a bingo card, like of all the key terms that we're gonna hear in a day. But it's now gotten so ridiculous, and I'm like, I don't even need it, because it's just so present that, like, but something that, like, that language just moves around in a very quick way, so much so that other people just keep saying it. I'm like, where did you get that word from? Like, why are you saying that word, right? Like, how is it? It's become stuck to like even the rooms, and it feels really strange in that way. So I think this opening is kind of trying to point at that to us. The ones who remained, comma, like her, comma, like, again, that's her, right? Being like, wither wheat, the exemplars, tested paladins, the ones who didn't throw up in the hallway and leave the vomit there. Again, 3 very different kinds of language: exemplars, tested paladins, and throw up in the hallway. Right? Again, this mixing and matching of kinds of language.
Yeah, I think all of my novels probably play with that register, with a kind of very sort of literary register, or even biblical registers, kind of medieval. I mean, I did at some point want to be a classicist, and I think I thought I wanted to be the Filipina Anne Carson at some point, and then ended up studying medieval French as well. So I think there is this, for me personally, for my kind of formation of making, I think I'm interested in roots of languages, in different language registers, but then also in a way dragging those registers to have friction and aliveness with the world that we actually live in, the world that we live in now. So I think that, and I think, because the way I approach language as someone who, yeah, well, grew up in a family where English was not everyone's first language, and but also, grew up working class, and so there is I think I always have a kind of sort of suspicion of, I think, yeah, the polite middle class novel and how it's supposed to sound. And so I think, I mean, and I probably need to at some point fill in that chip on my shoulder. But I think, so there is definitely that, the constant mixing of registers, and particularly here you have that sense of Gurley naming herself to be one of the best, but it's one of the best of a quite, it's quite a grim accolade. I didn't throw up in the hallway and leave the vomit there. Olympic medal to me. So that kind of, so to skewer that kind of like sort of biblical self congratulations is also the kind of, I think, core to also the way the humor works in the book.
Yeah, quite. Like, the bar is on the floor, right? Like, if that's more of it, then. But they'd been, to continue speaking of it biblically, separated. Like, that's very funny. But again, like, the to continue speaking of it biblically, like, that then feels like a different kind of voice again, right, from the others. It feels a tiny bit step back. almost like it's almost like you, but not you, right? It's almost there's a tiny little bit of something that's like it's a question for me about like proximity to character, right? How much of the book we're with Girly, like I don't there are very few scenes where we're not with her, right, in every kind of possible way. So like we're super tight with her consciousness. But there are so many times where I'm like, are we meant to be identifying with her or like not or stepping back? Our position sometimes moves right back and forth. Sometimes we're like, oh come on. And other times we're totally sucked into her worldview. So I think it's funny when these little moments break from that.
Yeah, I'm glad that that experience comes through because I think that is really vital to the how the book unfolds, that you are super, super close to this person and their consciousness, and then sort of dawning, realizing, "Wait, this person is wrong about a lot of stuff. Wait, hold
Yeah.
on." Well, and someone who's very sure of herself and very good at what she does and very sort of committed to that and has her own kind of humor and way of navigating the world that can be very sort of arresting but also attractive, because someone who just cracks jokes, is there's a certain kind of magnetism to how they are, but then realizing the kind of defenses ultimately that are producing that type of verbal fluidity that she has, her ability to skewer things, her ability to critical read. Ultimately, she's someone who would think that she is a very, very close reader, largely because she's someone who experiences the world in a state of
Yeah,
hypervigilance.
quite. But that hypervigilance is almost
But the humor of someone who is hypervigilant also being super wrong about things is,
yeah, because it's like that hypervigilance can make you not see things, right? Because you're so focused on like, well, this guy is going to be a bad guy, or like I'm ready for this thing to happen, right? I'm ready to see the bad thing. Then the next paragraph, like I feel like this is another kind of like the 1-2 punch, right, of the opening sentence. Then the opening sentence of the next paragraph, none of the white people survived. Now, the thing that I immediately thought of when I read that sentence, and I don't know if the book was in your head or not, I don't know, but it made me think of the opening of Paradise by Toni Morrison. The opening is they shoot the white girl first,
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah.
because then in the rest of that book, she doesn't tell you who the white girl is, right? She doesn't tell you the race of the character, so you don't know who the white girl is in that. But there's something about the kind of the blunt force of that. None of the white people survived. Like it had an echo in my brain that may not have been there, but there's something you're now telling us something very explicit about race as well in relation to what we've just had in the previous paragraph.
Yeah, no, I think I hadn't thought of I mean, yes, I think that is, yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, I think there isn't, well, there's an element of sort of, like I said, the kind of macro micro lens of sort of moving in, moving out, and now you're getting specific about, when you just read it there, I was like, wow, that could also be a kind of zombie epidemic novel.
100% that. Like, but and even that, not that there were many of them to begin with. Young middle class hopefuls bulging with student debt. They'd shown up around the time the position was still being called process executive. And you're like, I still don't know what this job is. Back when the site was still in the Bay Area, back when she still lived in the Bay Area, back when any of them still could, like that could still be a kind of like post apocalyptic something, right? Like,
Of course, yeah, yeah, yeah. And in a sense, it is a post-apocalyptic novel because it's a post-apocalyptic novel in terms of the 2008 economic crisis being the apocalypse of the 21st century for this community, but but also the apocalypse of the kind of the contemporary legacy of capitalism.
yeah, and the digital, right? Like quite particularly the yeah, without spoiling it. But anyway,
Well, the feudal nature of labor in the tech era.
yeah, and process executive. Like again,
Yeah, because that sounds
it
fancier.
sounds fancier.
So that's why there were still middle class people there doing the job then.
Yeah, quite. But again, like I like that repetition that you're like building. You've done a couple of times now. Back when the site was still in the Bay Area, back when she still lived, back when any of them. This repetition as part of her own rhetoric as well, right? Her own storytelling, as you say. Like this is something you can imagine her saying to people, right? Not that she goes to many parties, but like if she were to go, eventually she does, but like, not that she's always
Dragged there kicking and screaming
yeah, exactly.
by her family members.
Most of the white candidates didn't make it past the initial 3-week training course. The ones who did left within a year. Again, like both her narration of these other people, maybe the workplaces and description of the other people, and we're starting to the initial 3-week training course. Like, there's also something quite interesting here, skewering like the very best are not the white people, right? Like, so you're opening up a question here that it's like, what does then the reader do with that? Like, is that a good thing? Because then we find out we're like, wait, but what they're doing is like horrific stuff, right? They're having to look at horrific stuff. So then you're like, what is this? How is this skewering? And I think that's what's quite enjoyable about this book is that I don't always know what it's skewering. It's not a clear, like, this is like tech is bad, or like this is, you know what I mean? Like there's a really precarious line between what it means to like see difficult material on the internet, be invested in like other worlds, retaining selfhood, like all of these questions, right? But I think it's really interesting that here it's just like, well, the white people are shit at it. So
I love that you say that it's not always easy to know what the book is skewering, because I think that is really actually important to me. So I love the way that you put that. I'm glad that you said that. I think because if you're writing a novel that's ultimately about tech dystopia, it is very easy for it to be like, "Hey, tech oligarchs are bad. Have you heard?" And you're like, well, I could just go to the New York Times or the Guardian at any given hour of any given day and read a skewering of tech dystopia. So trying to think about, a novel or the world building that you're doing as something that has a more 360 view of it, and also something that doesn't just posit, you know, Girly as this exploited laborer who's never done anything wrong in her life, and she just lives a life of misery and tragedy as a minor character in these tech oligarchs' overarching story. But maybe her worth is in fighting the tech oligarchs, which ultimately is still a way of centering the tech oligarchs. So, thinking about ways to illuminate her life, but also, skewer her, show her vulnerabilities, her blind spots. And I think what you're moving between those registers and making it unclear about who and what is being skewered, or, having her in this opening chapter skewer a particular kind of, way of thinking or a particular group of people really confidently, and then later in the book sort of realizing, hey, I might have been wrong about that, actually I might be an asshole too.
God, yeah, everyone's life story. The majority of the workers had been Filipinos, with a smaller minority of Cambodian, Indonesian, Laotian, Vietnamese workers, people who knew about the job. And like here, you're starting to like, this is where it's also interesting, right? And it reminds me of How to Read Now as well, where you talk quite explicitly about white writers invisibilizing whiteness and only naming race when it's like to mark out other races, right? Or to mark out other identities. And here and throughout the book, you are very explicit often about characters' racial or ethnic or kind of like nationalities and all these kind of various parts of their identity. And I think it's really interesting that you list them here, right? There's something again, I don't know who's speaking fully, because that line is quite like removed or like institutional, right? Just like listing these like ethnicities. But then the colon is people who knew about the job through that reliable network, still unmatched by LinkedIn, which is suddenly like one of their language, like it's someone in that community speaking, right? That reliable network, which is like really funny. And I hate LinkedIn, so it made me laugh even more.
Yeah, I'm not on LinkedIn, so
Otherwise known as family, which is like a really lovely end to that sentence, right? There's like, again, you're moving so quickly between comedy, irony, and then kind of sincerity too. People who'd grown up knowing their mothers and aunts had been moderators, and so too would they follow. I want to talk about the so too would they follow as a kind of grammatical, that feels kind of Austen, right? That's not, and so too they followed or they would follow, but would they follow? There's a little grammatical inversion there that I feel like you're aping something.
yeah, I think. Well, I mean, first of all, I think this particular passage is doing, I think exactly what we've already been talking about. We're doing something where it's positing a kind of like census taking sort of voice, where it's like, well, the white people were out, the rest of the people were this, and this, and then sort of moves into an intimacy by saying, well, actually, who came there via family, and then you're starting to talk about mothers and aunts and the kind of the nature of how these laborers might come to work at this place. And I think some of that was coming out of all of the journalistic research I did around content moderation was so harrowing, and was so, and did focus ultimately on the kind of exploited nature of the work. And so the job of fiction always is to not necessarily reduce a person to the most miserable part of their lives. So I think that the kind of bringing in that humor, but then also bringing in that, well, how do people come to join? Then you're starting to see that actually the people who come to this job are people because they might be related to each other, they're family members. There is a kind of sort of community and sort of social fabric that is making up this labor force. But then, of course, by naming all of the sort of races, and particularly in this sort of, I think, Southeast Asian races, you're also, I'm also calling attention to the fact that this labor, like a lot of this labor and who does this labor and who is tasked to perform this labor has a colonial aspect to it. The kinds of people who do the most sort of exploitative underclass of labor in tech. And that's not just in tech. I mean, that we were talking about the feudal history of capitalism that is seeing its sort of contemporary iteration in tech. So there's that aspect of it. And I think, I think there can be, going back to the kind of sort of, I suppose, like middle class conventions of like novelistic language. There is this idea that sort of by naming someone as Laotian or Cambodian, that there's that, well, that's census language. We need to speak in a sort of higher register, or it's sort of it's gauche to mention, but I think those types of conventions sort of, besides being class conventions ultimately about what constitutes, good literature and what doesn't, is you're also deprive yourself of the kind of sensual and material humor of contemplating race as a material fact in people's lives. I mean, a lot of it is her just making fun of skewering people on a very specific basis, which includes, like her skewering of particular Filipino conventions, or sort of Southeast Asian conventions, or sort of tensions between sort of Asian communities within this particular force. And I think if you're not able to talk, if you shy away from naming or talking about that, you lose this whole sensual dimension of, talking about people's lives and how they relate to each other.
Yeah, it's about relation, but outside of the capitalist machine, right? Like aunts and mothers, not just like co-worker, right? Which is what we've had, but all of the cultural texture you get to that, right? Of all of their lives and their kind of particularities when they get together. But I love that it's also like had been moderators, because at this point, like we're now like, oh, what are they? But also, the title of the book is Moderation, which you can read in like so many ways, right? Like this is not just about content moderation, but content moderation means like removal. But like moderation could be, like, there's just so many kind of inferences of what moderation or what a moderator is. And when I think like mothers and aunts had been moderators, you might think, the person that stood in between like family arguments and dynamics and like made everything cool, right? That sense of moderation, but also moderation as, not excess. And what this opening of this book has given us, like a lot of excess, right? Like the book is kind of loaded with excess, really. So I think there's like a really lovely play here on what that word might signify as the story goes on.
Yes, absolutely. I think throughout the book, there's a kind of play with what moderation means for the book, but for the characters. But I think also in that, when that line says that their mothers and aunts had been moderators, and so too would they follow. You're also sort of, it also places you in time in a way, because it's saying, well, no, there's generations of women that have been moderators now, in a way that, so you're also, I mean, for me, it's also conveying a sense that we're kind of we're kind of in the future. This is not taking place in our current era, just because moderation has not been around in the way that I would say nursing has been. If I was writing a contemporary novel, I would say it would be nurses, for a particular community of Filipino women, and like mothers and aunts would be nurses, and they would follow. I mean, I think everyone hoped that I would be a nurse. So I think it's also sort of placing you in time where you think, okay, well, wow, okay, moderation has gone on for a while. This person has been a moderator for a while. There's been generations of moderators. So now you understand that we're also a little bit in the future.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. Before we talk about some broader questions, was the title like set in stone for you early on?
I think it was pretty set. When I knew that I was writing about content moderation, it was set in stone pretty early on. I think I knew that that was the title, and I'm not very good at picking titles. I think I don't. I think this is probably. I mean, I'm going to try to stick with shorter titles as as my career goes on, because that seemingly is the best way to go. But yeah, no, I think I knew this title just because of the, like you say, the multiplicity of meanings of moderation in terms of the labor, moderation, what does it mean to moderate yourself, and the kind of complexity of yourself for palatability of the rest of the world, what does it mean to moderate your experience of the world. But then also, of course, because the novel is sort of playing with the idea of what a contemporary Regency novel is or an Austen novel is, there is that sense of like moderation sounds like, well, persuasion, or these kinds of abstract nouns that can mean various things, or Pride and Prejudice, etc. So there's that nod or wink.
Yeah, for sure. Although your other two titles are also great. America is not, is like, and How to Read Now is like great, because it's like you do multiple things at once in titles. So I would be Yeah, be nice to yourself. These are good
Go
titles.
easier on myself. Okay.
Okay, I want to ask you about your writing practice. So, do you have a like specific writing practice? Do you get up at a certain time? Are you writing a certain amount each day? Have you got a desk?
Well, I think, I mean, I have, having written 3 books now, I do think I've realized that every book teaches you how to be the author of it. That, and I think you kind of think, "Well, I've got, I got 2 books under my belt now, so I know how to do this." And it's like, "No, you know how to write those 2 books. You don't know how to write this book." So I think, for me, it really depends on what stage I'm in terms of the writing of the book. If I'm still in the kind of research gathering and kind of world building and sort of, gathering, especially a book like America's Not the Heart, where I had to do a lot of historical research, that can just, I mean, that can take up months, and you can stay a long time in the research aspect of it, because the research aspect can be very, I always say that it's a little bit, the research aspect can be dangerous. Because I think, especially maybe for someone like me who has a constitution where it's like, well, if I just know more, that'll be better. No, the thing about writing fiction is that what actually helps you is being able to move into the unknown, move into places of uncertainty, and that actually parts of the book that are maybe emotionally true but have not been as sort of meticulously historically researched are still more powerful and resonate than something that's, you've done all the meticulous research of it, but you haven't bothered to write human beings. So I think, so it depends on, if I'm in that phase, then, I am a worm and I'm gathering a lot of, and it's like the worst time for people to ask you, what are you reading? Because then you're like, reading about virtual reality therapy and the St. Louis World's Fair. Like, okay, step away slowly.
Yeah,
And then
exactly.
if I'm in the writing of it, then usually, yeah, I will work from morning to about afternoon with breaks for dog walks, which I think has been, in some ways, the most important part of my writing practice. Is because I think before being a dog person, I would just, write all day, and then sort of like at 4 or 5 p.m. just realize you're in a kind of shrimp position, having not moved. And having a dog and sort of requiring you to get out of the house, to walk, and to kind of move within your thoughts in a different, take your thoughts in a different space, actually has been really helpful.
Yeah, and you're a typer, handwriting.
I'm a typer, yes. Right. I mean, I've been typer for a really long time because when I was a kid, I used to type on my grandpa's old US Army typewriter. So that was, I mean, so I wasn't even, and I think I must have been like 10 or 9 already at that point. And the typewriter was really loud. My parents would be like, it's the middle of the night, you need to stop. So that's why, even when I do, when people always joke about people who do the period and then 2 spaces, I still do that because I started really writing on a typewriter. So I do handwrite, but I have my father's penmanship. He was a surgeon in the Philippines, security guard in America, but he had that very cliche doctor's handwriting. And I think I do too. Whenever I sign books for people, I'm always like, I'm so sorry, that is not legible. So I mean, I could write books handwriting, and then I wouldn't be able to know what I'd written.
Yeah, you'd be like, Whatever that says."
Whatever that says, I'm sure it's brilliant.
When you're editing, you're not like scribbling on the printouts, or like are you editing straight on the screen? Yeah.
No, I tend to edit straight in the screen. I tend to edit that way, and then sort of things that I've deleted, or things that I've taken out, I sort of save them in a kind of sort of file of things that have been deleted from, this section of writing or something.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. I always want to know like how people are doing this
Yeah.
thing.
Well, I know some people work in Scrivener and things like that, that kind of help you sort of piece in a kind of like Minority Report way, sort of move between. But I don't think I've tried it, and I can't really work like that. It's not that I think I do work. There are stops and starts and sort of forward and backwards, but I think generally I work in a linear fashion. So I think the kind of moving around happens a little bit already after I've written, all of the thing or most of the thing. So I'm not necessarily someone who's like, oh, I think I'm going to put this chapter here or there. I mean, yet maybe for the next novel.
We'll see what happens in the next one. So my other question is always like, do you have an early memory of writing? And you've just said you were typing on that typewriter. What were you typing?
I think at the time it must have been. I think what was I really? I mean, at that time I think I liked a mix of kind of detective-y things, but also I was already getting, I mean, into classics and Greek classics, sort of like the kind of kids versions of that my dad gave to me. So I think I was writing a lot of stories. Although at that time, I often say this, that I can't remember a time where I wasn't reading and writing. My dad made me a reader really, really early on, so I started reading really early in my life and then started writing along with it. But I don't think I ever realized that that was a thing that I was it was like it's like saying that like, "Oh, I am my left arm." Like it's such a part of how I was in the world that I don't think I realized, "Oh, I'm a writer," until, I think maybe high school, until I was 16 or 17 or so when I thought, "Oh, I I think this is what I do." So, yeah, I think certainly the earliest memories my family would probably have of me writing would be that loud typewriter writer into the night. But yeah, I think that that's probably the kind of strongest memory I have of writing.
And always like fiction and in relation to these other texts, or were you, making up whole
Yeah, I
worlds?
think
Yeah.
when I was younger, it was always fiction. I think, yes, I think, sort of thinking about even when I was writing stuff that was sort of genre-y or sort of classics. I think the only short story I've ever written is a short story that's about, what was it called? It's called The Girlhood of Achilles, and it's about sort of Achilles' young kind of life when he's essentially in disguise as a girl, and the yeah, gender fluid Achilles. So I think, I always say if I ever manage to write another short story, it'll be a success because I still have such a long form brain. I genuinely I can't write short stories. I think, if I ever manage to do that, it'll be a real turning point in my writing. But so yeah, it was always fiction. I think even now, I was saying I don't know if I ever want to write nonfiction again.
That's fascinating to me because that book, How to Read Now, is so good. Even, not just like the thinking, but like even the sentences. You care about sentences. I mean, you should, but like not every writer cares about sentences. And yeah, I don't want to be too hot on the microphone today, but you know
I
what I
feel like
mean, right? Like I
this
think
is a
you
safe
care
place.
about
Obviously, as someone who's written that book, you know that I skewer things.
Yeah, exactly. But it's such like a amazing combining of both the form and content in the way that you would talk about fiction, I think. So yeah, please write more nonfiction. You're great.
Oh, that's very kind. I think the reason why I think that I don't want to write any more nonfiction, and this is not true of all nonfiction writers, and nonfiction writers that are better than me can write from a different place. But when I write from nonfiction, I do tend to write from a place of knowing, a place of this is something that I'm sure about, and my Virgo ass will now tell you about it. and and with sort of humor and vulnerability, to some extent, but there is a position of kind of certainty that I feel like I start from with nonfiction. And I do find that I love that book. I'm very proud of that book, and then proud of the only other nonfiction thing I've written is a very long form essay about dog rescue and German Shepherd, the history of German Shepherds, and I was like, that's my legacy. I think what I realize is that it doesn't starting from that position isn't as helpful to me as a artist. I think just because for me, I do want to move into places where I'm not sure, where I am uncertain, where I get it wrong, and experiment with the things that I don't know in a way that I feel like nonfiction doesn't afford me as much as fiction does. Like fiction is a scarier, riskier place to be, I think, for me right now.
Well, I'm excited for whatever you bring out anyway. So
I will take your words under advisement.
yeah, amazing. Okay, the last question, which is one I ask everybody because I always want more book recommendations. What things are you telling listeners to read? What are you going to thrust into their hands? Old, new, things you return to, things that are not out yet, whatever you want.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, this will be another hour. Well, this year I did finally finish my 20-year-old copy of War and Peace. Of War and Peace, which my dad and I had bought in a used bookstore in high school. I must have been 15 or 16. And this is just to give hope to anyone who thinks that they're taking too long to read a book. It's fine. 20 years is absolutely fine, or over 20 years. And I loved it. I was afterwards. It was the very much the kind of thing where you're like, "Have you heard of this amazing book, War and Peace?" Yeah, it's literally a global treasure. But I did. I really, really loved it, and I think because it's funny. I always say this. I sometimes when people ask what books did authors read as inspiration for their book, I sometimes think it would be better to ask, well, what did you read right after finishing it? Because I think when you're a writer and you're writing your book, a lot of the times you're going into it, you're finding out what you're writing as you're writing it. In my experience, the books that I've read right after delivering a manuscript for a novel have been where I thought, oh, this has nothing to this is going to be such a break from my world. This is going to be so nice. I've been writing, about this immigrant community for so long. I'm gonna read George Eliot's Mill on the Floss. Turns out George Eliot's Mill on the Floss is a Filipino novel. It's such a family novel about class, and so I think, I think you kind of subconsciously get drawn to things that you were thinking about and looking for things that will illuminate the thing that you've just done. So I think War and Peace was that, in a sort of, the way Tolstoy is like, yeah, Napoleon, very petty, boring, arrogant, don't focus on him, focus on, the kind of minor characters of history. So I think there was that aspect to it, of thinking about, oh, I'm not writing about tech oligarchs, I'm not writing about the Napoleons of tech, I'm writing about, the Bazookovs. And then I reread Zola's Germinal, which I'd read for the first time in university in French, and reread this time in English because I think I knew that there were some passages of the book that are not translated in English, which I find very telling. But I think, I realized, oh, I'm rereading this because ultimately it's this, novel about labor and labor resistance and miners and an exploited underclass of workers. And then I thought, oh, okay, wow. So Germinal is actually a tech novel because it's about how this particular type of tech is sort of deforming this society and deforming the societal relations within it. And then I was like, well, I guess Moderation is a 21st century miners novel then, in that kind of, so, thinking about how Zola sort of, and then I went off on a whole Zola tangent, and I was reading a bunch of Zola, which I won't. I mean, I won't enumerate now. But then, okay, I'll name only two more things. This is the thing that I just, if you'll see that I am, ultimately I'm a reader, because if you ask me to recommend to people, I'm like, well, this is actually what I want to talk about. Another thing that I read for the very first time, which was another thing where I was like, wow, have you heard of this? And everyone around me was like, Elaine, was Lord of the Rings. I'd never read Tolkien. I'd never read any of the Lord of the Rings, or even watched any of the movies. And then fully became an obsessive and was like in group chats with people. And so I realized that some of my friends had been hardcore Tolkien obsessives and just never talked to me about it. To the point where I think we created like an astrology chart based on Tolkien characters. like if you were like sort of Aragorn rising or something like that. And then I read Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, which I just loved. And I felt like it was also illuminating for me something that I was trying to do, which is, the thing that he says about joy, the consolation of the fairy story is the happy ending, and really thinks about the happy ending, thinks it through kind of critically in a close reading way, to your point. Is just I would recommend that to any writer to read on fairy stories, because the way he thinks about narrative and the morality of narrative. It's funny because I read that alongside, and maybe this is two things I would recommend for writers to read, is Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed, where he's a Brazilian theater practitioner, or he was, and was, lived under the Brazilian dictatorship, had been, imprisoned and tortured and lived in exile in a while. And his whole thing in that book is that tragedy, particularly Greek tragedy or Aristotelian tragedy, is a tool of state oppression. These are kind of, for someone who was a classicist, I was like, oh, this is provocative. So, but to think about, kind of narrative conventions in these ways, I was thinking, to think about how Tolkien thinks about the happy ending, and how Boal thinks about the kind of sort of oppressive nature of tragedy. I think that really resonated with me, because I think I knew that, for Moderation, I was like, I'm not writing an unhappy ending. This is a romance, and this is, for all the tech dystopia, I'm not writing, for all talking about the dystopian nature of tech, I'm not writing a tech dystopia. I'm doing something else. Those two books, I mean, I think they're useful for any writer who wants to challenge their kind of notions around, because I remember I taught those two texts at a university class, just like a writer in residence thing, and the students were so sort of like, wait, we've been told that happy endings are cliches. No, we're not. This is really making me. I mean, I kind of want, and it was so sweet because someone was like, "Well, I really like Tolkien, so I'm glad you said this," or I actually really like romance, or I wanted to write a happy ending, but I thought it's not literary, and I thought, God, it's such a political idea that the happy ending is not sort of worthy of serious literature, or even sort of contemplation or intellectual contemplation.
Right. Well, that happy is somehow, yeah, that's like, what does happy mean,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like,
Happiness.
it's
Yeah.
kind of resolution, right? We might talk about it in the narratological terms, right? It's just that the kind of disruption is being kind of like smoothed over again, right? I mean, Persuasion is just a long time being like, is this going to be a happy ending? Are we going to Is it? I don't know. Okay, so of all these book recommendations, so 3 really unknown writers: Tolkien, Dostoyevsky, and Zola.
Oh wait, let me name a contemporary one. I really love Karen Howe's Empire of AI. That's a nonfiction book. That is related to moderation in terms of talking about the the dystopian nature of tech. So if you want tech dystopia, that book really offers it in a really bracing and I think really fundamental way, especially for understanding the world that we're moving in and the labor relations behind it. I mean, of course, you briefly mentioned generative AI, etc. But I think reading that book is sort of required reading for people.
Yeah, that's been on my list for ages because I heard her on a podcast somewhere, and I was like, "Who is this person? I need to read everything she's written." So yeah,
Oh yeah. No, we met at in Edinburgh, and she gave a talk. It was fantastic. Yeah.
I also finished reading The Middle and the Floss like last month, which is really weird.
Oh, did
Yeah, I'd never
you?
read it before.
It's so funny also. And I just realized, but The Mill on the Floss also has an aspect where someone is really sure of themselves. Like that beginning aspect when she's with I'm gonna use the sort of culturally insensitive term because Eliot uses it, but she sort of meets the gypsies or Roma, the traveler sort of community, and she's like, I'm gonna be the queen of the travelers. I'm sure they're all gonna like me. And then they're all like, who is this white girl? I think that the way Elliot writes and skewers that scene of her sort of sense of herself, it's so funny.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a book just full of people who like think they know best about everything, and you're like, no, what? It's a strange book. Like, I was like, this book is going on for a really long time, and I'm like, I'm not even sure what's happening or where we're going. Such a wild read.
And then, oh well, I won't spoil the end, but
Yeah, yeah. This was so fun, Elaine. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
I had so much fun. These were amazing questions. I love the concept of a close reading podcast. I don't think I've ever done a podcast or an interview like that. It was really, really fun. And I got to think about the book in ways that I haven't.
Oh, that's so exciting to hear. Well, yeah, thank you so much again. It was great. Thank you for listening to this episode. Please subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a review and share with people you know. You can also follow the show and me on Instagram at Books Up Close and on YouTube. And if you can, please do fill out the feedback form linked in the show notes. It's really helpful to us. You can get show transcripts and more information by subscribing to the Substack. This show is made possible by an Impact Accelerator Award from the University of Hertfordshire and the Arts and Humanities Research Council.